Hey guys, happy Wednesday and welcome back to We're Fucked Until We're Not, a podcast talking about all things climate change for 15 minutes or less. Environmental education has been a little too kumbaya lately, and while I love optimism, I think that there's just been a bit too much flowery talk lately, and we need to be more straight up about the problems and solutions with climate change, and that's exactly what I'm here for. I'm your host, Mehul, and I'll be doing this every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Eastern. Before we go ahead, feel free to give us a follow on any of our social media channels. We're on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. But if you aren't really active on social media and still want to reach out, then definitely shoot us an email. I'll make sure to put all of the links in the description below. This is also last week's episode, so if you'd rather have episodes that are a week early and ad-free, then definitely check out our brand new Patreon, and I've already linked it in the description below. Now let's get into it. This week, we'll be talking about music and how it's related to a greater theme in sustainability. It seems like a pretty random connection, right? When it comes to music, we only think of two things. The first is concerts, and I know those seem like a super distant memory right now, but when we want to see our favorite artists live, we go to concerts or music festivals. And we already know those aren't the most sustainable things in the world. Coachella generated about 107 tons of waste per day back in 2017, of which only 20% was recycled. That's 428 tons of solid waste for the entire festival. But the most common way we listen to music and other media, as you guys know, is through private listening. Whether it was CDs, vinyls, phonographs, iPods, or whatever, music relied on people that listened to songs or albums at residences or parties. Now that streaming is really big, the way that we consume music is completely different than it used to be. It's become incredibly cheap and accessible, and it helps small artists grow super well. Heck, you guys are listening to this podcast because of streaming services. It's become so big that Spotify has over 250 million active listeners and Apple Music has over 60 million. That's a lot of people streaming content. Streaming feels super self-contained, and that's because it's always how we listen to music. The vinyls we use, and in my case still today, are contained within those vinyls. Even the MP3 we use to download, which is kind of a gray area on the legal side, but those were also contained on our phones and iPods or whatever we'd use. So when we stream, it feels like it's that way too. But the thing is, it's a lot more unsustainable than you'd think. Everybody knows that concerts aren't sustainable, and even bands like Coldplay pledged not to tour until concerts became more sustainable. The real issue is streaming. Now that sounds really weird, but again, that's just because we're used to music being self-contained. In fact, it was first thought that streaming would be greener than listening to CDs because we wouldn't be using that much plastic. The using less plastic part was correct, because in the United States alone, 61,000 tons of plastic were used to make CDs in 2000, which was its peak. In 2016, that number dropped all the way down to 6,000 tons. The same goes for vinyls as well. In their peak of 1977, vinyls as a whole used a bit over 13,000 tons of plastic. But streaming music is actually far worse than the physical plastic use of CDs. The reason why streaming works so well is because the music isn't downloaded onto our phones or computers. Streaming is essentially just a transmission of data. Even though their apps don't take much data on the devices of the consumer, music streaming companies need to invest in data centers to store and transmit their data. So in that case, there's actually some similarities here to cryptocurrency, which I talked about a couple of episodes ago. But these data centers use a lot of computing power, and because of that, they generate lots of heat. So along with a large amount of electricity that they use, they also need constant cooling. But with over 300 million people streaming music nowadays, that's a lot of cooling and electricity used at these data centers. This emits over 350,000 tons of greenhouse gas every year, but that's a study from 2018. Streaming has grown even further since then, and it keeps growing and growing as it reaches more parts of the world. Data centers usually account for an amount of emissions similar to the entire airline industry, but because of COVID, that number is expected to increase dramatically going forward. Not because of airlines decreasing, flying is going to be pretty normal when this all ends, but it's predicted that streaming services are going to take off like never before because they got so much exposure in the past year. More and more people have been moving away from radio because there hasn't been much of a commute anywhere, so this environmental footprint is only expected to get worse. And this definitely isn't me telling you to stop streaming music. This podcast relies on streaming. I spend an ungodly amount of time on Spotify, and if anything, the issues with streaming are a part of a larger set of issues, which is data centers, which I'll talk about in just a second. While we're on the topic of sponsorships, 20% of all proceeds will go to a mutual aid organization based in San Jose, California, called Community Got Us. Streaming is a part of the problem of data centers, which are creating a lot of sustainability issues worldwide, but we're moving more and more towards a cloud-based world. We don't realize how almost nothing we use is actually stored on our computers nowadays. Music is based on streaming. Our storage is based on the cloud like Google Photos, Google Drive, and iCloud. We edit all of our documents on things like Google Docs, Slides, and Sheets. And that's all been compounded after COVID hit. With the rise of video conferencing platforms like Zoom and Google Meet, from a convenience aspect, that's actually amazing. But because it's such an unconscious part of our lives, we never really take a moment to question how it all really works. The data has to come from somewhere, and like it does for music streaming services, it's housed in data centers. They're such a big part of our daily lives that they're considered essential services in many countries, and during COVID, they had workers come in because they were considered to be essential. Over 1% of the global electricity usage, or over 200 terawatts, goes to data centers. Most of them aren't powered by renewables, so there's a huge push to make them greener. The cool thing is, unlike a lot of my earlier episodes, there are a lot of solutions to this big problem that larger companies are actually going for. The demand for informational technology is supposed to grow up to 8% of the world's electricity demand, with data centers being a big part of them. Now, as fossil fuels and non-renewable resources are becoming more and more expensive, it's actually much cheaper for these big companies to opt for renewable energy sources. In fact, the market for sustainable data centers is projected to grow by almost $50 billion from last year till 2024, which is incredible. Because renewable energy has such a good return on investment but a really high upfront cost, the big companies opting for these changes are saving themselves a lot of money, while also helping to eliminate a really big sustainability problem that they themselves caused. It's not just on the company's end either. Schneider Electric's research found that 97% of customers are actually asking for sustainable commitments to be written in their contracts. This means that they understand how big of a problem data centers are and that they need to be fixed. And what's really cool is that big companies like Microsoft are already transitioning to using renewable wind and solar energy, which is really good news for these data centers. But there's a couple of really innovative solutions that these companies are going for as well. Microsoft is taking the unconventional route and putting some of its data centers underwater. In 2018, the company put a sealed container underwater with some of its technology to see if data centers could actually work underwater. They found a lot of really promising things. First, they found that the atmosphere underwater, if sealed properly, is great. The technology only needed to be changed every 5 years, and the failure rate was actually 1/8 of what they saw on land, meaning that they could take advantage of the oceans being naturally cool to help with their servers and data centers. They found that they could actually potentially house the center underwater and have it completely powered by wind and solar power too, which is great news. It would also use less energy than conventional data centers because there wouldn't need to be any light involved. Since there'd be no workers inside, they don't need any lights in there, and that uses a lot less energy than conventional data centers on land. So for them, going underwater is more economical and it helps our environment, which is a big win-win. Facebook and Google are taking a slightly different approach. They're moving their data centers up north to the Arctic. And as you know, while powering centers takes a lot of energy, cooling them is also a hurdle to cross. So moving to the Arctic helps them take advantage of that frigid air, and it allows these companies to use less power to cool their servers. What's even cooler is that the countries that they house them in, Sweden and Finland, are already powered by and committing to powering their data centers entirely by renewable sources. This helps them use both less power and improve their power sources already. It also helps create jobs there as well because the servers will need maintenance, so this boosts the local economies, which is a win-win-win. This is just another example of how sustainability is becoming more and more feasible, and how protecting our climate isn't a faraway dream either. Cutting down on their emissions helps these companies that are contributing to the problem in the first place, and as they start to realize that, I'll be able to have so many more episodes like this full of good news and climate solutions that are already being implemented. And I'd love to hear what you guys have to say, so if you want more resources, information, or you fall in love with the sound of my voice, I've linked all of the podcast socials in the link below as well as its email. But if you want ad-free episodes a week early, special access to resources, as well as lots of other really cool perks, join this podcast Patreon. I've also linked it in the description below. I'll see you guys next Wednesday.